few months ago, a friend and I were driving through North Dakota when we saw a sign for Fort Sauerkraut, and I'd never heard of this place before, so I went to go check it out. And when I learned the history, I have to say it's one of the most fascinating places in the state. Now, the story here is mass hysteria spreading amongst the German immigrant settlers and homesteaders in this region in the very end days of the Indian Wars. They were told in November of 1890 that 7,000 Lakota had broken free from the Standing Rock reservation, and as soon as they got the news, women and children began piling into trains and heading off to Bismarck, North Dakota, which they thought was safer. It was a large populated city. And everybody else who was a farmer headed towards Hebron, which was a German settlement. And on their way there, they began freaking out more and more. It was mass hysteria. There was one story, one man rode his cart so hard that he didn't even realize he'd lost his kids until he'd gone 5 or 6 miles, and he looked back to realize they weren't there. And when they got there, everybody was talking, sharing stories of what they had heard. They were sending letters out to their families saying, "We're totally surrounded by hostile Indians." And so they decided to make their own fort. Initially, Fort Sauerkraut was ground level wire, barbed wire, and that was designed so that if a hostile Indian party came through, it would trip their horses up. They carved portholes inside of raised dirt, which, because it was winter, they had to till it up with plows and oxen. And the final fort was a defensive fortification that looks like more like a car garage than anything, and a roof of railroad ties. Well, nothing really happened, and after a few days, they saw a cloud of smoke on the horizon, and they were fearful. They thought that this was it. They were about to shoot them when a local recognized them as the Hidatsa Indians under Chief Sitting Owl, and they really were about to fire into these guys, but they rode up, and the Hidatsa, they promised, "We mean no harm," and so they're sharing stories with the Hidatsa, and Sitting Owl is asked, "What does it feel like to scalp a white man?" And he says, "Oh, it's something like this," and he goes to demonstrate it to a man who only speaks German. And as he grabs his scalp, he uses the back of his hunting knife. And this German immigrant, he doesn't speak any English, he doesn't know the context of what's going on, he faints. And everybody else laughs. Well, they're all sitting around in this fort for days, prepared to meet a non-existent threat, and the only food they have is sauerkraut because it lasts. It doesn't go bad. It's like pickles. So they called it Fort Sauerkraut. And it would have been remembered to history if it weren't for the massacre at Wounded Knee. And I think that this says something about the general understanding on the Great Plains at the time. There was a fear of an uprising, especially in the immediate preceding days to this massacre. These people, these Native Americans, they were trying to make their way under Army escort to a friendly area, to the reservations, because the ghost dance was taking off. And they believed that in doing the ghost dance, they would be granted protection. But because the Army didn't recognize their citizenship, they didn't recognize them as Americans, they were fired into after a deaf man who didn't hear the order to surrender his gun kind of tried to take it back from a cavalry private. The cavalry up on the hill just began shooting into the camp of friendlies. They were agreed to come with the U.S. military, shot into their own men, killed many of the cavalry along with the Native Americans, and they tried to chalk it up to a battle, but it was a massacre. And this massacre at Wounded Knee is one of the most pivotal moments for American Indian history. It's been called the last massacre, at least the last regular Indian Wars massacre. And after this, much of the ghost dance religion died off, and especially the history at Fort Sauerkraut was totally forgotten by 99.9% of people outside of North Dakota. And I also just thought it would be interesting, as we're walking around Hebron, to show a little bit of the German graves here. You can see a lot of these are actually written in different dialects of German. A lot of these Germans came from Germans in Russia, which would be places like Volga Germans or Germans from Tiraspol, Moldova, or Ukraine or Crimea. And I've actually met a couple of these Germans and their ancestors in the Ukrainian Museum, a little bit further north and west of here.